we'll have four fellows from the data-driven decision-making program giving talks. And the first talk in this session is Estimation of Games Under No Regret by Niccolo.
Okay, so thanks a lot. So I'm Niccolo and I'm an economic theorist. And today I'm going to present some joint work with Lorenzo Magnolfi and Camilla Roncoroni. The motivation is quite simple. So many data are generated by some strategic interactions. Think, for instance, of pricing decisions by firm. And the standard assumption in the econometrics of games is to analyze these data by assuming that they are generated by equilibrium play in some game theoretic models. However, important economic environments are complex and dynamic in nature. Think, for instance, of online marketplaces. And because of complexity, equilibrium behavior is implausible. And therefore, these standard econometric techniques for the analysis of games need not apply. So what we do is to develop a method to estimate the primitives of complex dynamic environments. And we do so by following an adaptive approach, which is based on regret minimization. And the key intuition behind our approach is to use learning outcomes instead of solution concepts to analyze from an econometric viewpoint game dynamics. So what I will be doing today is just to give you an overview of the main econometric game and econometric theoretical ideas of the paper with a very simple toy model, which is a pricing game. There are two sellers of a differential. Everything extends to any large but finite game. So there are two sellers, I, 1 and 2. Time is discrete, denoted by n. And the environment is dynamic. And in each period n, the following happens. First, a profile of marginal cost for the two firms. The cost for selling a good realizes. Each seller observes the marginal cost and then set a price that can be either low or high. At the end of the periods, given prices, payoffs realize, so profits realize, and each agent, each seller observes at least an estimate of the realized payoff. Assume that these marginal costs evolve over time in an exogenous fashion, and the only thing that we assume is that, let's say, each path, or let's say the empirical distribution of marginal costs converge to some probability distribution with some full support on some set T. What we denote by the limiting stage game. The limiting stage game is the static game, the static pricing game, in which marginal costs are drawn from this limiting long-run distribution. And actually, this setting encompasses many stochastic environments. You may allow for perfectly persistent marginal cost, IID marginal cost, Markov chains, and so on. Complete information is just a special case of our setting. And we only make minimal assumption about what the players understand about the environment. That is, we know that each seller knows the set of actions, observes the marginal cost for selling a good period by period, and at the end of the period is able to at least estimate what the payoff from setting that price was, but no further common knowledge or monitoring assumptions. And we have the following econometric problem in mind. So the limiting stage game belongs to a parametric class indexed by parameter lambda, and we want to estimate the true parameter in the data generating process, lambda 0, having access to one of two possible data sets. The first one are time series data, in which we observe prices over time. The other one is simply a cross-section, in which we observe only an empirical distribution of prices at some point in time. Of course, the second data set can be derived from the first one, but not vice versa. How can we recover lambda 0? And we do so in two steps. In the first step, we assume a minimal optimality condition on behavior, which is we are going to assume that players are able to minimize their regret. And second, and then we establish new convergence results of game dynamics under the regret minimization assumptions to the set of bias correlated equilibria of the limiting stage game, the true one, given the true parameters. Let me be a little bit more precise about that. So let's treat each type of seller as a different seller. So a seller is identified by the identity of the seller and the marginal cost. What is the external regret of this, let's say, fictitious seller is simply the regret for not having played the best fixed price in retrospect, as we saw in the first week. Then what we show is that if each seller ITI's external regret is epsilon close to vanish in the long run, then the empirical distribution of prices, the time average of price profiles, converges to the set of actions which are compatible with the bias correlated epsilon equilibrium of the limiting stage game. So let me illustrate that with a numerical specification of our setting, of our pricing game. The red polytope are all actions which are compatible as bias correlated epsilon equilibrium actions. And this is the time average of play over time produced using a very simple, actually, algorithm, regret matching. And as you see, as time goes by, the time average of play approaches the set of bias correlated epsilon equilibrium predictions and stays there forever after. This means that after some time on, the time average of play enters a neighborhood of this set and stays inside this neighborhood forever after, but may keep moving inside this set. And this is actually the fact that may keep moving is bad from the viewpoint of learning in game, but as you will see, it's a good news from an econometric viewpoint. The second step is to define, to recover estimators of this parameter lambda 0 using the restrictions that are implied by the static equilibrium notion of bias correlated epsilon equilibrium and establish the convergence properties. So you can think of at least two estimators given our data generating process. One is simply the plugin estimators. This gives you all possible parameters lambda which are compatible with a single empirical distribution of prices as a bias correlated epsilon equilibrium action profile for the game. But and this one can be computed both with cross-section and time series data, because what you need is just a single empirical distribution of prices. However, if you have access to the time dimension, you have access to time series data, you may think about intersecting plugin estimators for various values of n. And what we show is that both estimators, almost surely, as n becomes sufficiently large, contain, so the true parameter of interest is inside this set. So which are the two takeaways of this one? First of all, is that a well-defined static equilibrium notion, which is bias correlated equilibrium, gives us practical and useful restrictions to estimate interactions which are dynamic under weak assumptions on players' knowledge and behavior in this environment. We simply assume that they minimize their regret. And importantly, cross-sectional data are sufficient to obtain estimates of a dynamic interaction. We don't need to have access to the dynamic, to time series data. However, time series data allows us to refine our bounds, basically to gain informativeness of our estimation strategies. Why? This comes from the properties of regret minimizing dynamics. As I was saying, if players are minimizing regret, the time average of play enters the set of bias correlated epsilon equilibria, but may keep moving. Therefore, if it keeps moving inside this set at different points in time, you observe a different time average of play, which corresponds to different bias correlated epsilon equilibrium action profiles of the true limiting model. And this one can be leveraged to refine the informatives of our bounds. And I'll show you that with an illustration. Let's consider now marginal costs, which are for simplicity idea across players and over time. And we want to recover from the observed play the variance of the marginal cost distribution. And what you see is that for a relatively large value of epsilon, this corresponds actually a small number, but in terms, it's a percentage of deviations from perfect regret minimization. So it's like in the order of 5–10%, depending on the player. You see that all estimated sets, these are the plugin estimators at different points in time, contain the true parameter of interest, which is 1. But if you take the intersection of just 3 of them, you see that your bounds are considerably refined, are considerably more informative than just by picking a single plugin estimator. So what we do is also to implement an empirical application with our method. And what we do is to study seller pricing behavior on Swappa, which is a centralized online marketplace for portable electronic devices. We scrape data for the most common iPhone models, and we use our model to estimate the distribution of sellers' marginal costs. I don't have time now to give you the results, but let me say that what we are working on these days is to use these primitives to basically conduct market design experiments and address market design questions, such as evaluating what is the degree of competition in this platform, or to see what would be prevailing prices if we give these sellers access to built-in algorithmic pricing tools in the platform. So there are, let's say, several questions, follow-up questions. I'm happy to talk about them afterwards. I'm done. Thank you. The literature in case.
Questions?
Yeah.
Both of you can ask.
So two questions. Like, what do you get ultimately? Is it like a compact set for the parameters, or
Yes. We always get a convex set.
you get a convex set, and then you would have to take some center if you wanted to have, say, one value. You would have to.
One value is inconsistent with this model. You cannot get, because these are partial identification exercises. So there is no criterion to pick one.
And do you have a sense of, like, if you were to use this in practice, if there is any form of non-stationarity, like that, in the sense of you need this limiting kind of point?
Yeah.
So how would that kind of affect your ability to use this methodology?
If you don't have at least this exogenous process, if it doesn't have a long run empirical distribution, we don't know what would happen, because we cannot define the limiting object, which is bias correlated equilibrium, which allows us which gives us useful and practical restrictions to estimate the model. But that's interesting, but we don't know what would happen. We would have to go probably to use a different approach.
Thanks. Very interesting.
Thanks.
The next speaker can set up. So this is how I read the problem. I have a game that is changing again and again, but there is a planted process. It is parameterized by one parameter, and what I want to discover actually is that parameter. That is the code, right? Yes. So I'm confused a little bit about why it is a convex set. In other words, I cannot have something like an unbiased estimator. I understand that there is variance, but can I have an unbiased estimator for the lambda?
Our estimator is a set. That's precisely the point of partial identification and incomplete models. So basically, this one will never give you point predictions unless you have, covariates or other things.
Let me ask a question that it is yes or no. If I have a infinite sampling, can I prove that I will converge to one point?
No, you cannot prove it.
Like I cannot have a large low number.
No, you do, but you do it, but it's applied to sets and not to point estimates, because the estimator is a set.
I see. The estimator is a set because of the epsilon.
No. Even if you set epsilon is equal to 0, is a set. Because the set.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have an interesting question to discuss.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Thanks for the nice talk.